everybody. Thank you all for coming. I can't tell you how much fun it is for me to be able to give a shout out to my friend Teddi, who I've known since forever, it seems. I've known Teddi since what, the 80s. We met when my wife and I were getting together, and Teddi was Jenny's first roommate at UCSB. So we go back, and when I first met Teddi, she was writing about Percy Shelley, and I was like, and so she was like Percy Shelley. For people who don't follow that, he was married to the woman who wrote Frankenstein.
The more famous Shelley.
He was married to the most famous Shelley, and he was sort of famous for a while for being sort of pre-thought and pre-fluid and pre-all this stuff. And people have been kind of trying to figure out his place in the cosmos for a long time. So when Teddi said, "Oh, I'm doing this book about wildlife crossing," I'm going, "Bing, this doesn't compute. How does this fit in?" But the fact that I had to ask myself the question really reflected the extent to which I hadn't been paying attention. Because Teddi grew up on Bakersfield, and her father, who I have a better sense of, I think, he was a community college teacher, and he had a great love of language, and a great love of literature, but I think what he really had, and what really infused in Teddi, was just this great love of the outdoors. And so when I would get hung up in this academic idea of Teddi being focused on poets and whatnot, and right now she teaches and had forever at UCLA. She teaches writing, literature, all kinds of things in that ballpark. And that, I forget that like once or twice a year, Teddi goes into the great backwoods by herself, and this is how she recharges her batteries. And she is all about nature. And so when you think about that, and sort of the urban nature interface in which we all live in, this idea of animal crossings for hope just seemed like such a obvious, smart, and necessary idea. A while back, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I wrote about this genetic engineering firm that is trying to bring the woolly mammoth back from extinction. And they're trying to recreate the genomes of the woolly mammoth, which is kind of an interesting, grandiose, egotistical idea. Ultimately, what they hope to do, is they justify it, is they were going to use that technology to bring back creatures that are on the brink of extinction right now and help save them. But the problem, or the shortcoming, I would say, with that thinking is, if you don't have habitat, it doesn't matter who you bring back. You have to have habitat, and that's why they go extinct in the first place. And one of the first areas where we see the habitat is where animals try to come down the mountainside to go towards the ocean, and they just become roadkill. And we've all, many of us have experienced it firsthand. We see it off to the side of the road all the time. And in the last couple of, 15 years, it's become kind of a sexy issue. With P-22, who is like the most charismatic cougar anybody met, or Puma. I guess he died just recently, but he managed to make it over the 405, over the 101, and into Griffith Park, and everybody's going, "Oh my God, we have to do something." So $92 million later, there's a Wallace-Annenberg crossing, and it hasn't quite opened up yet, and poor P2 has died. But in the meantime, what Teddi has found out with her book is that this is all over the world. They do this. This is not something that P2 invented or LA invented. And in fact, just up the coast by Gaviota, we have it's not quite as ambitious as the one that they have down there, but it's a culvert by Gaviota that they're going to expand, so that a lot of critters who would otherwise get wiped out trying to go over the 101, they manage to survive. And what they find is that a lot of the fear is, this is going to be a great place for predators to pounce on the prey, and this will be like, fast food. but that hasn't worked out, and it really does. It makes a principal difference in keeping creatures that might otherwise, go the way of, rat poison or go the way of automobile collision to survive. And the other thing here that what Teddi tried to do, she tried to write a very educational, broad view of the whole thing, but creeping into it is sort of her love of the wildlife and her love of language. And while I was reading through it, I kept coming across references to the western spadefoot toad. And I think she has some sort of secret Jones. But it's like any excuse I can just sneak that in there. We're going to get a western spadefoot toad porn. And it turns out, and then I'm going to shut up, but it turns out, why is it called the western spadefoot toad? You had to read a while to have it explained. There's an appendage to one of the feet, which is like a very hard bone that they use as a shovel to dig deep into the soil, which is baking because they live in the desert. And so it saves them from the heat and it saves them from predators. So again, it's a place where Teddi's love of the outdoors and her love of language sort of collides in some happy language. So I will turn it over to Teddi, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, so basically I want Nick to do this instead. This is my favorite reader ever. I mean, you read it really carefully. I am obsessed with western spadefoot toads. I kept bringing them in again and again and again. And Nick and I were emailing a couple of days ago, and one question he asked was, what was sort of a downside to this project? And the real downside was not being able to write a whole book, first on the western spadefoot toad, but then on every other creature that was so interesting and strange. And so my editor kept saying, this is not a book about this species. It's about wildlife crossings. So you are my ideal reader. Thank you so much. Okay, so I also want to thank Michael and Jen, there you are, for inviting Wildlife Crossings into your legendary store. I've been haunting Chichester since the 1980s, so congratulations on 50 years in November, so thank you. I'm also really honored to be with Rebecca from the Santa Barbara Wildlife Care Network. She and they are doing really, really important work, and she'll be talking to you after, during this presentation. So thank you so much for coming. For me personally, quintessential Santa Barbara includes a lot of great places and people and memories. Hendry's Beach, I guess it's called Arroyo Burro, but we never called it that. No. Hendry's Beach, the Arlington Theater, the Botanical Gardens, capybaras at the zoo for sure. Isla Vista during my undergraduate days invoked the Twin Towers of Francisco Torres, and that's where I first met Nick's wife, Jenny, who became a lifelong friend. I also remember from Isla Vista the incredible sandwiches from long gone Grandma Gertie's, if you guys remember that place. And then finally the odorous apartment that Jenny and I moved into after the dorms, and we called it Mildew Manor. So those are all my, not all of them, but some of my great Santa Barbara impressions and memories. Chaucer's books and the Santa Barbara Independent, though, both reside deep in my deep memories and present day enthusiasms. So I'm really glad to see them come together with Nick being here, and obviously we're here at Chaucer's. Okay, so let's get started. Here's our quote to keep in mind. For every organism on Earth, movement is life. And this is the ecologist and evolutionary biologist Erica Zabaleta. Again, for every organism on Earth, movement is life. So I want you to really keep that quote top of mind. I want to give a shout out to the amazing illustrator of this book. This is Jamie Green, who's done a lot of books. This is my first book for children, so I was really lucky to be connected with her, or with them, I should say. Books for a Better Earth is the series, and it's a pretty new series. So there are some picture books, there's books for elementary kids, and then my book is for middle schoolers and older. This was supposed to look good. Books for a Better Earth, my printer ran out of ink, but you can kind of get an idea. Books for a Better Earth. So this is the sad version. And just one more shout out. So this series includes a book that's coming out on Tuesday, and I encourage you, if you're going to get it, to get it here. Buy all your books at Chaucer's. It's called Sustainable Structures. It's by my friend Kate McMillan, 15 eco-conscious buildings around the world. And again, she's wrote and illustrated it, and it's, again, for middle schoolers. But I think adults can enjoy it as well, and my book too, I hope. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just kind of a little survey. I want you to think about an animal that you would like to keep safe from roadways. I'm sure all animals, all of the above, but just choose one. And Dana, my friend Dana, has a little bag that she's going to circulate. So if you would write down the name of that animal and just pass the bag along, and at the end we'll put them all on this poster and take a picture of the poster for our Instagram. I've gotten a few kind of satirical responses, I guess. I don't know if I would call them that, but one was a brontosaurus, one was a unicorn, one was a leggy blonde. So I would kind of prefer, it's okay if you want to be funny, that's fine. But anyway, you can be funny if you want, but maybe a real animal. Okay, so it could be a native, local species, or something from a different region or ecosystem. Whatever you want, even those funny ones is fine. So they will eventually end up on the poster. Okay, so we're going to kind of begin with a version of a very old joke, probably now qualifying as what's called a dad joke. Why did the raccoon cross the road, or the black-tailed deer, or the monarch butterfly? One of my friends came up with the best answer, because he didn't want to be a chicken. That's pretty good. I like that. But what's the conventional answer? Why did the raccoon cross the road to get to the other side? Okay, so we need to think about what's on the other side for these creatures. So I want you guys to just shout out some answers, like why are they even doing this? We're just like, don't do this, it's so dangerous and horrible. But what do they need? What do creatures need? Resources, so such as water, food, shelter, procreation, mates, absolutely. So to reproduce, all of those things, absolutely. Maybe they also just need some space that we're not dominating. So that's part of it too. They're getting away, they're moving towards something, but they're maybe also moving away from something. So they're getting away from buildings and noise and lights and roads and more roads. So they have to cross a road to get away from roads in a way. So I think we all know that crossing roadways is not the easiest or safest thing for animals. Whatever name we use, we're all aware of what's called roadkill. Other names are WVCs, wildlife vehicle collisions, I like that acronym, or vehicle strikes. Organizations like the gruesomely named Project Splatter in Britain monitors these too frequent incidents and then kind of figures out this is where we need a crossing. So these are really important organizations, and I kind of love that name. So trying and failing to safely cross the road is obviously pretty awful, but when animals don't try at all, that's just as bad on both the individual level and also the whole population level. So local commutes by, say, toads and turtles or Tasmanian devils, long distant migrations by grizzly bears or antelopes, these are prevented. So they're stuck. So they're maybe in a danger zone with predators or us, and we're predators too, or at least they're in a place where they can't get what they need. So if getting hit is the worst thing that can happen to a creature risking a journey across the pavement, and not risking a journey strands them in hostile or sterile territory, what are some other ways that you guys can think of that traffic might harm individual animals and whole ecosystems? What are some things about roadways that bother you? So not just being on the pavement and the dangers, but what are some effects of roads? Sound. Okay, so, and I think, sound and noise is maybe the less euphemistic way of saying that. So noise, what else? Fumes, absolutely. Yeah, toxic fumes. What else? Heat, absolutely. So what we call the urban heat effect, when there's lots of concrete and pavement, it just generates more and more heat. Absolutely. I mean, you can even think about dust and vibrations. All of these things come together. Yeah, Lights, absolutely, especially at night. And night is when a lot of creatures are traveling. So that's when they're, even if they're not trying to cross, and you talk about deer in the headlights, the lights can still really bother them. So we'll talk about that. So what's called the road effect zone spreads out far beyond the road itself. So we really want to think about roads as, really sort of these invaders in a way, to the habitats of these creatures. So for us, they're pathways to desired destinations, but for the creatures who don't even dare to venture across, they're like a solid wall. Road ecologists, I'll explain that term in just a minute, call this a moving fence. I think that's a really great term, a moving fence. So road ecologists study the effects of roadways and traffic on nature, and that would be on plants and animals, waterways, climate, and soil. So this is a fairly new discipline, probably 30 years old, but they're the ones who are at the heart of these projects, these bridge projects, which we'll get to in just a minute. So right now, over 40 million miles and counting of roads encircle the planet. So just kind of keep that in mind, and there's more and more coming. So what these roads tend to do, along with other infrastructure and development, is create what are called habitat islands. And so when Nick was talking about loss of habitat, that's huge. So there's like this project, what's called de-extinction.
Right.
It's just, it's crazy. It's like, let's take care of the animals we have here and make sure that the habitat is preserved. So these islands or patches create these small spaces where animals have to compete for resources in the grimmest ever version of the Survivor franchise. This is really horrible, and a lot of these patches are disconnected from each other. Okay, so that's all pretty heavy. The book is called Corridors of Hope, and the subtitle is Connecting Creatures Around the Globe. So really the book is focused on the hope and the connectivity. So conservationists, wildlife biologists, and road ecologists have found that specially made bridges offer the best way out of traffic trouble for wild roamers. So how many of you, I'm sure you've all heard of them now, especially if you've been paying attention to the Wallace-Annenberg project, but how many of you have seen a wildlife bridge or maybe a picture of one? Most of you have? Okay, so if you're commuting from here to LA, you're gonna drive under one that's under construction. We'll talk about that in a minute. So anybody wanna give any impressions that you have of any either underpasses you've seen or overpasses, wildlife bridges? And I'll just show you, this is one of Jamie's illustrations. These are the Banff. Banff has the largest system of crossings in the world. So they have 6 beautiful overpasses, and then the rest of them are nicely hidden culverts. So the good news about wildlife crossings is a lot of them are hidden from us. So that's a great thing. Yeah, you just saw it.
I just
Jody
saw several of them, yes.
Yeah.
Traveling on some horseback rides in
Yeah.
Wyoming, especially
Colorado.
Nevada,
Yeah.
Washington.
Right.
And it's you're driving up, and sometimes you can see even before you get to the crossing that there's a series of fences.
Yes.
There's some channeling.
Yes.
Animals away from the
highway.
road and towards this area, like a big funnel.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that.
And,
yeah.
And then it's interesting, many of them are very well landscaped.
Yeah.
So it's almost a little forest,
Yes.
a little ecosystem on top of the bridge.
Yeah, and Jody.
Offers some cover.
Yes.
And invites them to go across.
Yeah, Jody sent me some great pictures. There's a really famous pronghorn bridge in Wyoming, Trappers Point, and so a lot of them are called, they're forested bridges or green bridges. So we'll talk about the native plants as well. So bridges, as we all know, are part of infrastructure like highways, airports, energy hubs, railways. Wildlife bridges are something newer, less human-centered. Some call them animal infrastructure. I really like that term. Or green infrastructure. That's kind of great. So the folks that I interviewed, that's what they're concentrating on. So first of all, how do we know where to put them? What do you all think? How do we know siting, S-I-T-I-N-G, is one of the first questions to answer. So where do we put these darn bridges? Rebecca, what do you think? How do we know?
For, migration.
Yes. That's the biggest thing. Like, where are they moving? So where the wild things are, to quote the great title, and where they're going. So if we know they're using what are called corridors, which we'll talk about in a minute, that's where you have to put them. So roadkill hotspots like the one on Gaviota, that's a really good indicator too. We need one there. Animal tracks and poop, radio-collared critters, camera traps or trail cameras, and advice from local residents. Say, oh, this is where the corridors are. So all those tell us it's not just random that we're going to spend. Usually it's not 92 million. They're usually a lot less than that. But this is where they need to go. So what forms do they take? Well, the famous Banff ones. These are called overpasses or overcrossings. Tunnels or culverts. Those are usually the kind of the less expensive version. And then there's also something called canopy bridges, which I got really excited about. They look like monkey bars, and they're for monkeys. And so they're strung from treetop to treetop. And so, for example, in India, lion-tailed macaques will go just swing across them. So those are 3 different kinds of crossings. So how do we make sure that the animals will use them? And Jody mentioned fencing. I mean, that's really important. Exclusion or funnel fencing, sometimes running miles along the highway, will help guide these animals towards the crossing. Also, animals prefer dark and quiet paths, and that's almost a watchword. Again, dark and quiet paths, dark and quiet paths. You hear this from road ecologists and conservationists. So we need to make sure that the road crossings have kind of light and noise mitigation. Some of that will be through the materials, some of it will be through plants. So again, to create these dark and quiet paths, scent markings are sometimes but not really often used. So for example, in Kenya, where they built an undercrossing for elephants, they put some elephant poop in there. And then after that, they didn't need any scent markings. It's like, okay, one went through and then now thousands a year go through. The most important ingredient is native plants. So that's for shelter, food, familiarity, and so to forage, but also to give a sense of home. There's something, and I love this term, so Nick mentioned that I really like language, and I some of this was just the terminology was so fun. So there's a phrase called faunal furniture, so F-A-U-N-A-L, so furniture for animals, like IKEA, for critters. Rocks, logs, brush piles, something called a bubbler, which is like a drinking fountain that's embedded in the bridge itself. All of these are examples that help the creatures feel more at home on these human-constructed bridges. Crossing structures, as we know, need to be part of this larger wildlife path called a corridor. So the crossings are just the structure. The corridor is the migration path itself. So if they're not connected, if these bridges are not connected to a migration path, they're really bridges to nowhere. And that's an expensive bridge to nowhere, especially that $92 million one. So these are studied for years. The Wallace Annenberg broke ground 2 years ago, but they've been studying that place for 15 or more years, that this is the right place to do this. Okay, so I want you to think about what are some other ways besides building crossings. Again, some of these are expensive and they're time consuming. I mean, these projects take a long time. What else can we do to kind of keep animals safer? Well, because they are going to be crossing the roads, what can we do besides making these bridges? How can we change our behavior? I guess let's put it that way. What do you guys think? Think about driving habits.
Being more aware.
Being more aware.
Night driving especially.
Yeah,
back in the mountains, and that's when they travel a bit.
Yes, night.
Yeah.
Absolutely, night driving and dawn and dusk. So that's really when they're most active. So being really alert during those times. What are some other things you guys can think of?
Restrict development.
Oh, absolutely, including roads, and more roads. So, build fewer roads. And there's something called road ripping, which I love that term too. So taking out roads, that are, like decommissioning them and then taking them out. I mean, obviously we can't do that with the 101, but some of these roads that are invading wilderness spaces, a lot of folks are taking the roads out. Driving slower is actually really important too, because they find where the speed limit is higher. I mean, again, this is logic, it's common sense, but you know, try to drive more slowly. Stop building so many damn roads. So that's, okay, well, do you think folks should be allowed on, do you think people, I should say, be allowed on these crossings? No, Raven, why not? Why is that not a good idea?
And that's the reason we built it, was to keep it away from people.
Right, so it's, yeah, and even people on foot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially with their loose dogs, you know, who are terrible. So absolutely, so our scent, our presence, our noise, our sounds, all of those are gonna really discourage animals from using these. So most of the bridges that I wrote about are wildlife only bridges. There's one in the Netherlands that it's a co-use model, but they really keep the two, like the human trails, very separate from the wildlife trails. So, but that's very rare. Okay, so I just want to say a couple of things about how I got interested in this, and Nick is absolutely right. My dad was a naturalist in the Coast Redwoods for many years, and I got very much enamored of that area. I do go, and you gave me a little bit more credit than is due. When I go camping, it's car camping. I do not go. I go to a state park. You're so nice. I don't backpack, so I take my car, I set up a tent, then I go hiking from there. So, but I still really like to camp. Okay, so ever since I was a kid, I've noticed roadkill. I think we've all noticed that. So that's very disturbing. But on a happier note, I've always noticed too, like these weird little drain pipes and culverts, and these we might even call them accidental wildlife crossings. They're not what are called dedicated structures, but animals use them. So the one in Gaviota, which I'll talk about in a minute, animals are using them. It's just not big enough. So try to keep an eye out, you know, for these kind of natural crossing structures. Okay, so P22 was also a huge inspiration. He was the LA mountain lion that Nick mentioned, who braved the 405 and the 101 to end up alone for 10 years in Griffith Park. And this is my P22. He's very sweet. He's got his radio collar. So most important, so he helped inspire my book, but much more important, he helped inspire the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. And this is in Agoura Hills. It's going to be the largest wildlife crossing in the world. It's going to hopefully be open for business, animals only, not us, in 2025, but it might be closer to 2026. Finally, I want to say something about Santa Barbara. As Nick mentioned, Santa Barbara has its own crossing project in the works about 30 miles north at the Gaviota Pass. You all probably know this is a very notorious roadkill spot. Way too many animals hit every year, and 200 to 300 kinds of creatures losing their lives. Badgers and bears, king snakes and pond turtles, barn owls and hummingbirds, butterflies and yellow jackets. And the folks who designed these crossing structures don't just think about what we call charismatic megafauna. They're also thinking about, you know, amphibians and lizard, reptiles, amphibians, even insects. So, for example, one organization called Coastal Ranches Conservancy is working with other local nonprofits and Caltrans. I mean, we often think of Caltrans as the bad guys, but they are putting a lot of money into the Wallace-Annenberg project and also into this one in Gaviota. So they have on-staff biologists, you know, wildlife specialists. So Caltrans is evolving, let's put it that way. So this culvert right now is too small for larger creatures, especially deer. So the smaller creatures are using it, but they're going to expand it so larger creatures like bears, mountain lions, and deer will be able to use it. It's a roughly $10 million project as opposed to 92 million, and they've already received 8 million from federal funding for the upgrade, and that includes the fencing that Jody mentioned. I don't think Candace's husband was going to be here, but I'll give her a shout out anyway. Candace Menigan, the executive director of Coastal Ranches Conservancy, gave me this information, and I met her and Beth Pratt, who's the great fundraiser and P22 best friend forever. She was up at Gaviota, and so I went and got to meet them and see that site. Okay, so I'm going to read just if you can stand this, I'm going to read a couple of short excerpts from the book, and then we'll talk to Rebecca and do some Q&A. So I often touch on the themes of scale in the book, so big versus small, and also over versus under, and that's a whole other conversation because animals have preferences in terms of do they want high and light or dark and under the road. So I won't go too much. I won't go into that. So the first little excerpt highlights big and over, and the second takes us under the road into some very tiny tunnels. Okay, so this is from the first chapter, and it's called Home Ranges and Ranging Beyond, Liberty Canyon, a Biodiversity Hotspot. On a warm summer California morning, I stand on a mountain slope, fragrant with sage and spiky with dry chaparral. A lizard scampers under a nearby rock, and a red-tailed hawk hang glides in the breeze. Just over the ridge behind me lies the Pacific Ocean. I gaze across at the golden brown hills to the north, then down to an incongruous sight. 10 lanes of pavement, an 8-lane freeway running alongside a 2-lane access road, the former thick with traffic whizzing through the canyon in both directions. This formidable roadway, US Route 101, which we all know very well, extends from Washington State down to Southern California, where it divides the Liberty Canyon Natural Preserve. Not far from Los Angeles, Liberty Canyon and its surrounding areas are part of what scientists call a biodiversity hotspot, and there are only 36 of these in the world. These hotspots are rich in extraordinary flora or plants and fauna animals that are direly threatened by human disturbance, which can include housing, infrastructure, croplands, and climate change. So although the traffic itself is but one of many dangers to wildlife, the 101 freeway decisively divides, and again we talked about this habitat fragmentation, divides a vital dwelling place whose creatures need to move freely from place to place. As one extraordinary animal named P22 made dramatically clear to Los Angelinos and eventually the world. In 2012, a young male carnivore made an incredibly perilous journey from his birthplace somewhere in the Santa Monica Mountains to Griffith Park in the heart of Los Angeles. He traveled east at least 7 miles, and the person that I talked to who knew him best, he thinks it's about 7 miles. Some other experts say as many as 50 miles. We can never know because he didn't get the radio collar till after they found him in Griffith Park. But it was a lot, and the biggest thing was the freeway crossing. So it's not just the distance, but it's the type of journey. Miraculously, he made it across these busy freeways. He also faced other hazards we can only imagine. Scanning Griffith Park remote camera photos one day, wildlife biologist Miguel Ordeñana was shocked to discover the unmistakable image of a mountain lion, also called a cougar or a puma, hence P22. This is the region's most charismatic and most threatened species. As news of this sighting got out, followed by stunning photos, local residents were captivated by the beauty and bravery of P22, and by the unlikelihood of such a wild creature camping out in the United States' second most populous city. As those living near Hollywood tend to do, they made him an international celebrity. They also embraced him as the handsome mascot for a remarkable and remarkably ambitious project, a massive bridge across the 101 freeway in Liberty Canyon that will soon help mountain lions and other native animals find safe passage and one another. P22's story reminds us that wild animals of all shapes and sizes live and move among us, even in a bustling metropolis like Los Angeles. His odyssey also prompted his countless fans to wonder, why did he leave the mountain stronghold of his birth? And what can we do to help make such excursions safer for all wild creatures, many of whom don't navigate the human landscape as expertly as P22. So you have to read the rest of the book to get answers to those questions. But I just want to remind you, this is the really famous Steve Winter photo. So Steve Winter is a National Geographic photographer who I got to meet in Gaviota, which was amazing. And this is probably the most famous image of P22, and it's worldwide fame. It got him worldwide fame. So I'm just going to read one more, if you can, again, bear with me, one more really quick. Do I have time to do just one more little excerpt? And I'll just do part of this, just to introduce you to tiny tunnels. So this is big tunnel, or big overpass, salamander tunnels in Massachusetts. So I'll just read a little bit of this. In Amherst, Massachusetts, amphibian-loving residents guide thousands of native spotted salamanders towards two specially built tunnels beneath a busy road, the first wildlife crossings in North America constructed specifically for amphibians. Each year, the swarming salamanders migrate from upland habitat to vernal breeding pools on the other side of Henry Street. Until 1987, the first night of spring rain in this New England town brought not just wandering salamanders, but also a bucket brigade of adults and children who stopped cars, scooped up the amphibians, and carried them across the street. Now, Big Night requires fewer crossing guards, as two tunnels, each approximately 28 feet long, protect the creatures from the mass squashings that used to mark the occasions. So maybe we'll just leave it there with the mass squashings and think, okay, that doesn't happen so much. So that's sort of it for my little, my little presentation. Thank you very much. And I want to invite Rebecca. So I'm just a novice here. I'm learning about this. I'm an English teacher. I mean, this is somebody who's actually working with wildlife and rescuing wildlife and doing the practical things. So I want you to talk about that.
Thank you. I mean, this is fabulous to be here, and a wonderful book and occasion. And I think educating the different generations is really the most important work we could do, because understanding these stories and issues is something that not everybody gets to understand and are privy to. So, can I ask, how many of you guys have ever caught an animal in your backyard or had an injured wildlife encounter? Okay, so most of you. I don't know how many of you are familiar with our organization, but we span from about Santa Maria to Malibu. So we have a huge area that we cover with animals that we take in, and typically we've seen about 3,500 animals in a year. We surpassed that in August, so we're looking at more around 4,000 to 4,500 animals this year of about 220 different species, give or take. So if you think about the diets and the habitats and the enrichment and all the things that you have to get, oh hi, I'm seeing one of our volunteers here. But if you think about all the things that we have to do to support these creatures in returning to their natural habitats, it's a lot of work, and it's only growing. And I think part of what the crossings really touch on that isn't really known maybe as much as that when somebody brings us an animal, one of the most important things that we ask is, where did you find it? Because we have to release it back to that area, and in many instances it's within a 1 mile range of where we found it, because that's their home. And so just like we have roads and homes and cars, so do these creatures, and the ability to have something that's made for them to facilitate something that is natural for them in terms of migration and foraging and looking for mates, that's something that we've taken a long time to really consider as human beings as something integral to their performance in the wild. So thank you guys for anybody that's here that would like to come and visit our center. We're not typically open to the public because most of the species that we have are injured or sick, and then we have something in the area called HPAI, which is the highly pathogenic avian influenza, which I don't know how much you guys are familiar with, but we just try to mitigate our footprints as much as possible. That said, if you're interested in coming for a tour or seeing the center, please feel free to take one of our brochures and come and visit us. It is pretty exciting. Right now we're sort of transitioning away from baby season into our seabird season, which makes sense if you think about winter coming in storms and, domoic acid. I don't know how many of you guys have heard about the sort of sea lion incidences that are occurring. I know some people here have. We see a lot of seabirds that are suffering from that as well. So ours is a number that I say is just good to have in your phone, because you don't know when you're going to need us, but when you need us all of a sudden. And so we've become this kind of community service where, just as humans have EMTs and 911 call centers, we have us, except, the animals don't really have health insurance. So there's some differences which make it a little bit trying, but it is something that we're getting a lot more down to a system as we've been here as an organization. So, anybody that's interested in working with wildlife or doing any kind of outreach and education, we are always accepting people. We try to tempt you by saying you can come feed cute baby things and then merge you into the other areas. But they are very cute, even though we're not supposed to say cute. They're interesting. So
Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So what are some of the main causes for them ending up in your
Sure.
facilities?
I mean, you kind of touched on it. When animals, there's forest fires, there's storms, there's droughts, there's all of these different things, there's heavy rains, but when the animals come down from the mountains and they meet into the cities, or when humans go out into the mountains and our worlds collide, there's just things that we're not as nuanced in understanding that help wildlife, strive in their habitat, and also humans. And so there's a lot of ways that we can more peacefully cohabitate with one another. Obviously car strikes are a huge issue for us. The amount that we take in, though, based on a car strike is probably less than we see some from other things, because normally the damage is
fatal.
Is really severe. We do see a lot of poisonings from rodenticides in different things that people are using, in their gardens and their soils. It's sold in many places, different kinds of traps, glue traps.
And he got mange from eating rodenticide and almost died. So it's really hard. Water sources are trickier, so we get a lot of animals that are massively dehydrated or malnourished. We've had a pelican incident the last few months, which was something that we also had about 2 years ago, when we received about 200 to 300 pelicans over a 48-hour period, which, if you've ever tried to feed 200 pelicans, it's a lot of fish and it's really stinky. And most of us come to us completely emaciated. How many of you are familiar with oil in the area? So oil is a huge thing for us because of the natural seeps that occur off of our coast. But for birds, especially pelicans and some other animals, getting a spot of oil on your feathers is like having a hole in your sweater, where a pelican's body temp is around 102, 103 degrees. It's much higher than ours. And so as soon as the water gets into their feathers, they're not able to keep their body temperature up. So they become really cold, and then that interferes with how they can fish and hunt. So you start seeing them do some erratic behaviors. They're getting closer to fishermen. They're getting more, aggressive to try to get fish that are easier to find. We've seen pelicans in the surf, when the surf breaks, which is really abnormal. So you just see a lot of things that you wouldn't notice otherwise. And there's a ton of ways that we interact with animals and wildlife that we just don't really maybe intentionally do things that are problematic for them. Just like, the raccoons that get into your yard and dig up your vegetables that you just planted aren't really necessarily trying to be nuisances, but it happens. And so I think, one of the things that I always end with is that a lot of people call our hotline not because they found something in an emergency, but just because they have a lot of questions about how to deal with something that's maybe also living in their attic or under their basement, and they just want to figure out what to do with it.
So just please know we are here as a resource for all of those things. Thank you.
So many questions for you. Do you guys have questions about the? It's the Santa Barbara Wildlife Network. I think you've got
It's
some.
a mouthful.
Don't
Yeah.
you have some like
Yeah,
little pamphlets or? Yeah.
Sure, I brought one of our latest
gonna steal
newsletters
one. Is that
and
okay?
yeah, of
Okay,
course,
thank
and
you.
some flyers that have our hotline number. We're undergoing a web sort of upgrade, shall we say?
Should we start
But-
these around if somebody wants
Yeah.
to take one and they can whatever
these
you
are
don't
the
take will end up
easiest.
back here then? Okay, so we'll
Sure.
just start those. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you guys have questions for Rebecca?
I just have a quick
Yeah.
question. Is this a hotline that's like 24 hours?
It is. We typically don't answer in the middle of the night. We're open 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, but we try to cap our intakes at 5 because even when we do that, our staff is mostly there until 11 o'clock at night, triaging or bandaging the animals in care, but we do try to call as much as.
I was just concerned because I had a fox just the other day.
Oh,
that
really?
Had obviously been in a fight.
Oh.
And it was bleeding from the throat.
Oh.
And it didn't appear where my daughter and I could get it until about 6:30 at night.
Yeah.
And we took it in. One of my neighbors is actually a vet. She
Okay.
did some subcutaneous fluids for it, but that's all we could do. And by the time morning came, it passed.
Yeah.
And we felt so much that if we'd been able to get timely help, because its eyes were bright,
Yeah.
and
I
that was the problem. It seems like so often they appear just like when your dog gets sick. It's always on a holiday,
Yeah.
when the vet
Right.
is not available.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.